Lesson number 4 looks at writing equations and intercepts given a vertex and a point. So we go back to this standard equation. Y equals a times x minus p squared plus q. A is my stretch factor. It's my reflection. P and Q are my vertex. So if I give you a vertex, we're going to skip down to class example number 1. If I give you a vertex, you can substitute it into the equation. If the vertex is -2 and 8, where I see a P, I can substitute in a -2, and where I see a Q, I can substitute in an 8. Then I need to figure out what A is. To figure out what A is, I'm going to use the fact that I have a point on the graph that was given to me. If I have a point on the graph, it means that if I substitute -1 in for x, this side of the equation has to equal 7. Because the point -1 and 7 has to be found on the graph, which means it has to make the equation true. So if I substitute in 7 for y, and -1 in for x, and actually instead of writing this as 1 minus -2, put it as 1 plus 2 now. I now have an equation that I can solve for A. What's -1 plus 2? And what's 1 squared? So I will get A by itself plus 8. To get A isolated, subtract by 8 on each side, and what would A equal? -1. So then my final equation will look like this. Y equals, instead of A, I can put -1 times x minus -2, which becomes x plus 2 squared, plus 8. And I don't necessarily need the 1 here. I could just write it as negative bracket x plus 2 squared plus 8. Now, part B says rewrite the equation in the general form. General form means no brackets. So what it means is expand this out. So when I go to expand this out, I am going to write the -1 so I don't forget about it. But the x plus 2, I'm going to physically write it out twice. The reason why I'm going to write it out twice is so that I don't make the mistake of when I go to use the distributive property. Because written like this, our brains, and just the way that we're at with our level of practice, we're going to be tempted to write x squared plus 4. And when you actually expand it out and look at this distributive property, there's going to be a 2x and another 2x. There's actually going to be a 4x in the middle. Okay? The pattern for these, if you don't want to have to write it out, and if you can remember the pattern, we square the first and we square the last. To get the middle term, multiply these together and double it. So if I had x plus 3 squared, I would mean I'd have an x squared, I'd have a 9, and then I'd multiply those two together, which would give me 3x, and I would double it. And I would get a 6x. If this was x minus 3, I'd have a -6x. But the x squared and the 9 would always remain positive. Okay, to finish this up. Multiply everything by negative. I get a -x squared, a -4x. I'm going to get a -4 that when I combine with the positive 8, will leave me with a positive 4. And then C says, use a graphing calculator to sketch the graph and determine the x and the y intercepts. Well, the y-intercept, I can probably figure out because the y-intercept is when x equals 0. So when x equals 0, I have 2 squared, which is 4 times negative plus 8, which is the same as the constant right here. So I know that it has to go through this point here. And then I have a vertex at negative 2 and positive 8. And the graph opens down. So there's my sketch. And then I can find my x-intercepts. To find my x-intercepts, you've used the 0 function of the graphing calculator. So if I put the equation in, it doesn't matter which of these 2 equations you put in, you're going to get the same graph, and I'll show you. So if I go negative x plus 2 bracket squared plus 8, and then negative x squared minus 4x plus 4. And we'll put this on a standard curve. So the little dots in the corner tell me the calculator's still working, and when they stop flashing, it means that the calculator's done drawing. If I look at my table of values, the y1 and the y2's match. The other thing that I could do too is with the y2, I could scroll over to where the line is on the far left-hand side, press enter and make it a thick line, so that this time when I press graph, it draws the first graph, and then it draws the second graph, and it makes the second graph appear as a bold line. So then again, you can see that they're the same graph. So that kind of tells me that I did the 2 equations correctly. I went from one to the next one correctly. To find my zeros, it's that left-bound, right-bound thing. So if I want to be this 0, I have to be on the left side, which is above it. Press enter. Then I have to be on the right side, so I need to be below. I make sure the 2 arrows point to each other, and I get 0.8284. It does say answer to the nearest hundredth if necessary. So this is not it's not that's not a rational number because it doesn't come to a termination. So I would just write it as 0.83. If I want to do the other 0, this time when I go to the left bound, I would actually be below the x-axis, and the right bound I'd have to be above. But again, notice the arrows point to each other. Press enter again, and I get negative 4.83. So my 2 zeros were 0.83 and negative 4.83. Which means that my sketch up here is slightly off, but it was just a sketch at that point. We can use the equation of a quadratic function written in standard form. This is my standard form, that y equals a times x minus p squared plus q, to find x and y intercepts algebraically. I always find y-intercepts the easier one to find first because that's when x equals 0. And my equations are usually written as a y equals, so it's easy to just plug 0 in for x. So I get 3 times 0 minus 1 squared minus 9. What's 0 minus 1? And negative 1 squared? Positive 1 times 3. And what's 3 minus 9? Negative 6. So there's my y-intercept. X-intercepts are a little bit trickier. In an x-intercept, y equals 0. So y being f of x. So 0 would equal 3 times x minus 1 squared minus 9. So how would I solve this? How would I get x by itself?
Would you have to like FOIL it out?
No, I wouldn't FOIL it out.
No, I mean, well, don't you have to split up the x minus 1 squared?
Nope, I wouldn't do that.
You have to.
Nope. I'd get rid of the negative 9 first. How would I add 9 to each side? Then what would I do? Divide by 3. What's 9 divided by 3?
3.
How do I get rid of the squared? Square root. So I'm going to square root both sides. Only thing I need to remember in this case is when I square root both sides, this square root of 3 could be a positive or a negative. Because when I work backwards, root 3 times root 3 is equal to 3. Or actually, it's better if I put it this way. If I had 9 equals x minus 1 squared. If I square rooted both sides, I could get a positive or a negative 3. Because 3 times 3 equals 9, and negative 3 times negative 3 also equaled 9. So I'd have to make both considerations in this case. And then how do I get rid of the negative 1? So x would equal 1 plus or minus the square root of 3. I could write it as plus or minus the square root of 3 plus 1, but we generally put that in the front for appearance purposes. It makes it less likely that we put that 1 underneath the radical sign. So when you have your equation in standard form and you're finding the x-intercept, just start picking apart this equation. Don't expand out the quadratic, because you're going to cause, you're going to get to a quadratic that you can't factor, or that you might not be able to factor, in which case you're not going to be able to find the x-intercept. This one, even if it's not a nice number, because this is not a nice number, it's a irrational number, I can still find it though. With the quadratic, when I get down to this point of something x squared plus something x plus something else, I'm not going to be able to factor it, and I'll be stuck. Okay. If I give you a graph, can you write the equation from the graph in standard form? How do I write the equation in standard form? What do I know about my graph that I can use in the equation?
Your vertex is -1 and 2.
So my vertex is -1 and 2. What letters represent my vertex in my equation?
P and Q.
P and Q. So what would I write in for P? -1. And what would I write in for Q?
2.
Okay. I still have 3 more letters to solve. How do I do that? Or how do I solve for the A? How do I figure out what A is? So I use this point, What does that other point tell me? Yeah. The other point tells me if I substitute it in for x and y, it has to make this true. It has to make a true statement. So if y is equal to 1, when x is equal to -3, the statement has to be true. And all I did is I changed this minus -1 into a +1. So -3 plus 1 is, and -2 squared is, so I get 1 equals 4 times a plus 2. I want to get a by itself, so what would be my next step? And I would get -1 equals 4 times a, and what would a equal? -1/4. So then my equation would be y equals -1/4 times x plus 1 squared plus 2. That negative in front of the 1/4 tells me that my graph opens down. So even before I finish the a value, I should have known that a is going to have to be a negative. Okay, if I look at B, finding the x and the y intercepts algebraically. So if I find the y-intercept first by letting x equal 0, I get y equals -1/4 times 0 plus 1 squared plus 2. So 0 plus 1 is 1, squared is 1, times -1/4 is -1/4. We're dealing with fractions. I'm going to change the 2 to be 8/4, because that's how many quarters would be in 2 whole. And what would be -1/4 plus 8/4? 7/4. So I leave it as a fraction. And then when I do my x-intercept, I let y be equal to 0. So my first step would be to get rid of the positive 2, which means I would subtract 2 on each side. And then I need to get rid of that -1/4. How do I do that?
Multiply by -4.
Multiply by -4, so I now get a positive 8. And then what would be my next step?
Square root.
So I square root 8, so I get a positive and a negative. And then I would subtract by 1. So I'd write this as -1 plus or minus the square root of 8 equals x. Is 8 a simplified radical, or can I simplify it? I can simplify it because 8 can be written as 4 times 2. And what's the square root of 4? So I get -1 plus or minus 2 root 2 is equal to x. What's my domain? Any number. X is an element of the real numbers. What's my range? So look back at the graph. What are my y values? Can it equal 2? Okay. So anything less than or equal to 2. And what is my axis of symmetry? Is that, but it has to be an equation. So what's the equation of the axis of symmetry? X equals. I don't think I want to give you all of these questions. (2b) and 4b. and then 5B. And then 8, 10, 11, and 12. And you'll get time to work on this.